Okay, so next week we have our first presentation, right? So, Nick, you're presenting a week from today on war. And then Ashlyn, you'll be presenting the following week, I believe, on Monday, right?
Yeah, May 3rd.
Wait a minute.
Yeah.
I thought I was presenting on Monday.
Yeah, the 26th.
26th?
Yeah.
If that's what it's scheduled, I'm good to be there.
Okay.
I'll be both, or I'll be one or the other.
Why don't you do Wednesday?
Wednesday?
Yeah.
Okay. No.
If I think that, okay, if I think that I was thinking that the reading I was going to have you doing for Monday would include the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. It doesn't. So we'll give you an extra 2 days to get your presentation done. And then, Ashlyn, yours will be a week from Monday. Okay. I'm also. I also wanted to note that I will get you guys an assignment sheet for paper 2 over the weekend, and also the other thing that I need to give you, sample questions for the exam. So yeah, all of that is forthcoming. If you don't get it from me by Friday, send me an email to prod me a little bit. I'm directing a community theater production of Antigone, and it's taking up a lot of my free time and mental space, so I'm becoming more forgetful and disorganized than usual. So helpful reminder. What's that?
Where's it gonna be, the Rylander?
No, we're still not quite comfortable doing indoor shows yet. So what we're going to do is rent the train station on Jackson Street for a weekend in May, and we're going to put it on there. Yeah, and right now just keeping my fingers crossed that it doesn't suck, because we don't have a lot of time. Okay, so does anybody have any questions about anything?
Are we having class on May 10th?
So May 10th is, I think, scheduled just as a review day for the exam in both of your sections. So attendance that day will be optional. But yeah, if you have questions about the course and the exam, that is kind of last chance to ask them. So, any other questions? Okay, great. Then, what do you guys want to talk about today?
I want the changes in Sam.
Okay.
Yep.
All right, let's start there. So, what do you note about Samwise and the changes in him in this part of the book?
He becomes more his own person, more brave.
Okay.
And he charges after a huge spider.
Yes.
And he puts on the ring.
Yeah. He takes a couple of things from Frodo that I think are symbolically important, right? On the one hand, yeah, he takes the ring. And if we want to look at this from a psychoanalytic perspective, right, I think we've already discussed the idea of the ring as both a symbol of completion and also as what is called a yonic symbol, right? That is a female, a symbol of female sexual energy, right? Rings, cups, things like that tend to be tend to fall into this category, right? And what else does he take even before he takes the ring?
The vial. Galadriel's
Yeah, he takes Galadriel's vial. And this thing comes in handy a couple of times here, right? And who's always the one that remembers it's there?
Sam.
Yeah, Frodo keeps forgetting he has it, right? But Sam is the one who keeps remembering, hey, you've got this light in your pocket, right? And I think that this is also symbolically important, right? Because what does Sam seem to keep holding on to that Frodo doesn't?
Hope.
Yeah. Sam keeps holding on to the hope they're going to get through this, right? Frodo seems to think that everything's going to end when he tosses the ring into the cracks of doom. And doesn't care what happens after that, right? Sam is retaining some level of hope for the future. And so he's the one who keeps remembering light. And this is going to become a more important element of the characterization of both hobbits when we get into the Return of the King, as they're trekking across Mordor, trying to get to the mountain, right? And so, yeah, both The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, right, are both about a trip to a mountain, either to gain a kingdom or to throw power away, right? But there's one other thing that Sam picks up.
Sting?
Yeah, he picks up Frodo's sword, right? And the sword is the kind of counterpart to the ring, right? If the ring is a Yonic symbol, the sword is the obvious phallic symbol, right? We remember even, from The Hobbit where, Bilbo was keeping it in his trousers, right? And so I think what happens in the Shelob episode is that Sam becomes a more complete personality, right? So this is Sam's initiation into maturity. And he does so through a kind of catabasis that's a little bit like the one in the Mines of Moria, but I think has some important differences, right? So, what's the journey through Shelob's tunnel like?
Pitch black.
Yeah.
Black, hot,
Dark, hot, yes.
hostile. Feeling hostile. Like, I think it mentions, Frodo mentions he became suddenly overwhelmed with a feeling of hostility.
Yeah, there's a hostile will in this place. Good. What else? What's the primary danger apart from Shelob herself and getting caught in the lair?
Lost.
What's that? Yep, getting lost.
Or coming across orcs.
Now, I think to focus on for a second on this notion, the possibility of becoming lost, right? In Moria, they had Gandalf, right? At least up to a point, They were almost out by the time Gandalf fell, right? So they had a guide. They had somebody to get them through. And then when Gandalf falls, they still have Aragorn, right? The world's greatest ranger. So here, right, who's their guide?
Gollum.
Yeah, Gollum, but he's led them into a trap, right? So their guide in this case is treacherous rather than helpful and nurturing. But what else is a danger in Shelob's lair here? Apart from the possibility of getting lost, the darkness, the heat.
Running into orcs, being found out by the Nazgul.
Okay, the possibility of getting caught, right? But even more so, the possibility of getting literally caught, right? There are webs that block the passageways, right?
sting can go through.
Yeah. And there are a couple of things I think are particularly important about this particular underworld journey, right? First off, the shape of it, right? It's a tunnel. And the fact that Shelob is described as female. Now, if we want to stick with the psychoanalytic interpretation that goes along with the ring and the sword, right? In Jungian psychological terms, what Shelob might represent is what's called an anima. So I don't know, how familiar are you guys with Jungian personality theory, if at all? Okay, you know it. So what do you know about it? What do you know about the parts of the personality, according to Carl Jung?
But the anima and the animus.
Uh-huh.
The anima is the feminine aspect of the personality, and the animus is the masculine aspect of the personality.
Yeah. And essentially, yeah, what this is the element of the opposite sex in your personality, right?
Yeah.
So only men have an anima, and only women have an animus, right? And in a well-integrated personality, right, you are able to deal with this and integrate it into the self, right? Right, the self, right, Jung calls the ego the kind of anti-self, or like the dark self, is the shadow. And the final element of personality is what he calls the persona, right? That's the mask that you wear for self-protection, right? But yeah, a lot of psychoanalytic critics read fantasies and fairy tales in Jungian terms, and in particular, they are interested in what they call anima possession. And what this usually looks like in fairy tale terms is when you've got these stories about a kind of like devouring female figure, right? You know, like a female fairy who captures knights and imprisons them, or a female vampire who feeds on men, right? And one step in the hero's journey in a fairy tale of this sort is often to overcome that anima possession, right? This idea of the devouring female, and often to reform her and make her more, quote unquote, socially acceptable, right? Now the argument is that he's not really reforming another person. What he is dealing with his own anima, right? That he's getting over his fear of the feminine side of his personality and integrating it into the whole. And I think there is a lot about Shelob and the way Shelob is described that resembles this idea of the devouring female, right? What do we note about Shelob's own appearance?
Multiple eyes. She's spider-like.
Okay, yeah, she's a spider, right? A giant spider, right? There's many eyes. And that seems to be, that notion of many eyes and vigilance seems to be associated with evil things in general, right, in the novel.
Those spider eyes don't have lids, do they?
I don't know for sure, but I don't think so.
So, again, lidless eyes.
Uh-huh. Let's see where else she shows up here. So yeah, there are the eyes. If we look at the first page of the choices of Master Samwise. Might be the second or third page for you. There's the paragraph that starts, "Now the miserable creature was right under her."
381.
Okay, thank you.
Got it.
Now the miserable creature was right under her. For the moment out of the reach of her sting and her claws, her vast belly was above him with its putrid light, and the stench of it almost smote him down. Still his fury held for one more blow, and before she could sink upon him, smothering him in all his little impudence of courage, he slashed the bright elven blade across her with desperate strength. Now there are a couple of words in this that tend to recur when Shelob is described. Right? For one thing, like the physical aspect of her, right? What part of her body is emphasized here?
Her
Your
belly.
side.
Her vast belly, yes. And if we look at, say, like early human cultures and the art they made, right? Well, a lot of them make these female figures with these kind of vast, distended bellies, right? That demonstrate. It's like a womb thing, right? It's a fertility thing. What else is emphasized about like the effect that Shelob has on Sam?
She smells.
She smells terrible, yeah.
Like to the point where
Uh-huh.
just the scent of her is going to make him pass out.
Yeah. And what is that sensation described as here, right? Still his fury held for one more blow, and before she could sink upon him, smothering, yeah. And yeah, devouring and smothering are, in fairy tales and fantasies, often kind of like coded feminine ways of killing, right? The idea being that the anima, right, the feminine personality, overwhelms the rest of the personality, right? That's what the fear is, right? That the hero can't integrate the anima into his ego because he's afraid of that part of his personality. He's afraid of it overwhelming him and making him less of a man, right? So, the basic problem with using this particular kind of reading in this case is what? How do the fairy tales that I described to you usually end?
The night winds.
Yeah, the night wins, right? And Samwise chases Shelob away, right? In fact, what we get here, Shelob was gone, and whether she lay long in her lair nursing her malice and her misery, and in slow years of darkness healed herself from within, rendering her clustered eyes, until with hunger like death she spun once more her dreadful snares in the glens of the mountains of shadow, this tale does not tell. What does that sound kind of like? Think back to the Volsungs.
When they say, well, it's understood that character's dead.
Yeah, when they,
Come back.
or yeah, when that character is no longer involved in the story, right? Whether they're dead or not, right? Shelob is out of the saga.
Yeah.
So it's that same kind of thing, right? So we don't know what Shelob's ultimate fate is, right? So what doesn't happen here is that reform and integration that usually happens at the end of a fairy tale, right? So I think that what's going on here must be something a little bit different, but I'm not entirely sure what. I think that this is kind of part of Sam's process of maturity, right? He drives away the evil thing, the smothering, devouring feminine, right? I think that Shelob does have those characteristics. But I think that, like, this also does kind of have something to do with the way the novel deals with femininity generally, right? For one thing, is Shelob a creature that travels?
No.
She's, yeah, isolated to this one spot, right? She's static, right? Like Galadriel, like Goldberry, right? Like Arwen. And wait, okay, so she's stuck in that one spot. And what was the other thing the other thought that I just had that has now completely escaped me?
Changing? Maybe? Maybe not touched by time like Galadriel and Arwen?
Yeah, I mean, she is a relic of the First Age, right? She's been here from time immemorial. So yeah, she is also unchanging, right? Right, she's not an elf, but she seems to be functionally immortal. Right, she's outlived generations of her own offspring. Well, yeah, well, she did, right? I mean, it tells us that she did. That, you know, she's, you know, sired offspring on other offspring of her own, whom she then devoured. Well, you know, spiders.
Can't read.
But yeah, so yeah, she's static, she's unchanging, and she seems to exist largely to provide the heroes with a test, right? Galadriel tested Frodo, and Shelob seems to be mostly testing Sam.
Sam could have easily just hightailed it and ran back to the Shire.
Uh-huh.
And chose to defend Frodo.
Yeah, well, yeah, we'll talk about those choices that he makes and the ethical. This part of the book seems to be rife with ethical dilemmas, right? We have, you know, just to lay these out for a second here, right? Right, we have Faramir trying to figure out what to do with Frodo and Sam, who have technically broken the law and are trespassing, right? We have Frodo, who is forced to deceive Gollum in order to save him. And then we have Samwise, who has to decide whether to abandon Frodo or abandon the quest. Right? He can't both stay by Frodo's side and complete the mission, right? It's a one or the other proposition. So yeah, these ethical dilemmas are all over the place here. What was the other? So they're testing, static, unchanging, devouring female. There was something else that I wanted to say about this, and now I cannot remember for the life of me what it was.
She can't speak.
Although Shelob is able to make her intentions pretty clear, right?
Well, you know, a huge spider with multiple eyes and pincers and claws is looking at you.
Uh-huh.
Pretty clear she's going to eat you.
Yeah.
She's not going to invite you to tea. Or to look in the mirror. She's going to make a snack out of you.
Yeah. And I think it's like when we, like all of the other feminine figures we talked about, right, we looked at, are all in some way seemingly kind of associated with the light, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Shelob is just all over darkness.
Well, you could say like Galadriel and Arwen they're associated with light, but they're also associated with healing. Whereas Shelob
and also night and day, right?
Yeah.
You know, Arwen is associated with night and with evening, and Galadriel with the day. Yeah, go ahead, sir.
They're nurturing and healing,
Yeah.
whereas Shelob is poisonous and just wants to kill everything.
Yeah.
So maybe not even saying like darkness is bad, it's just Shelob's particular darkness is bad.
Yeah, well, I think we noticed that the darkness takes on a more ominous character as they enter her lair, too. If we go to the beginning of the Shelob's Lair chapter, what have we noticed Sauron's servants always seem to be described in terms of? if we think about the things like the ring wraiths, for example,
Nothingness?
and the belt, yeah, exactly, a kind of void or a kind of nothingness. Good. And if we look at the beginning of the Shelob's Lair chapter, can I get somebody to read that first paragraph? It may indeed have been daytime now.
It may indeed have been
Thank
daytime
you.
now, as Gollum said, but the hobbits can see little difference, unless perhaps the heavy sky above was less utterly black, more like a great roof of smoke. While instead of the darkness of deep night, which lingered still in cracks and holes, a gray blurring shadow shrouded the stony world about them. They passed on, Gollum in front and the hobbits now side by side, up the long ravine between the piers and columns of torn and weathered rock, standing like huge unshapen statues on either hand. There was no sound. Some way ahead, a mile or so perhaps, was a great gray wall, a last huge upthrusting mass of mountain stone. Darker it loomed and steadily it rose as they approached until it towered up high above them, shutting out the view of all that lay beyond. Deep shadow lay before its feet. Sam sniffed the air.
Okay, thank you. So, as they're getting closer to Mordor, as they're entering Mordor, right? Once they're on the other side of the tunnel, that's it, right? Welcome to Lugburs, right? What do we notice about the environment here, and how might it be related to this idea of Sauron's servants being kind of voids in creation or nothings?
It's filled with shadow.
Yeah,
It's a shadow world.
it's filled with shadow. We have this notion of like these unfinished statues, right? Right, everything's gray. So what we have here is like almost like a kind of no place, right?
A no man's land.
Yeah. We'll get a more specific kind of no man's land when they're actually trying to cross Mordor. But while we're talking about that, like once they get into Mordor, right? Not to get too deep into this yet, but I want to talk a little bit about the orcs conversation here, right? The conversation between Shagrat and Vorbag, because this also reflects the experience of the average soldier in the First World War.
I'm looking for it. Starts on, was it 389? Start.
What I'm looking for is what starts with Lugburs wants it, eh?
Oh, I found it. 391.
Oh, yep.
Okay.
Do you want to read it or do you want me to?
Oh, yeah. Lugburs wants it, eh? What is it, do you think? Elvish, it looks to me, but undersized? What's the danger in a thing like that? Don't know till we've had a look. Oh ho, so they haven't told you what to expect. They don't tell us all they know, do they? Not by half, but they can make mistakes. Even the top ones can. Shh, Vorbag. Shagrat's voice was lowered so that even with his strangely sharpened hearing, Sam could only hear just catch what was said. They may, but they've got eyes and ears everywhere. Some among my lot, as like as not. But there's no doubt about it. They're troubled about something. The Nazgul down below are, by your account, and Lugburs is too, something nearly slipped.
Okay, pause there for a second, right? So I want to sort of like focus on this idea of the top ones. What do they mean by the top ones?
The Nazgul?
Okay, yeah, maybe the Nazgul specifically,
Or
right?
the upper, like the orcs that are higher up.
Yeah, basically the higher ranking people who are running the war, right? So, think, generals, etc., right? And do Shagrat and Vorbag, who seem like they're just kind of, ordinary garrison commanders, right? Do they trust the top ones?
No.
Do they trust their own men not to spy for the top ones? Yeah, so there's a good deal of suspicion here, right? Particularly that the upper ranks don't have their best interests at heart, right? That the upper ranks aren't looking out for them. In fact, like here, they're specifically accusing the top ones of withholding information, right? Right? They don't tell us all they know, do they? And then a little further down, where Vorbag says, "I'd like to try somewhere where there's none of them."
Wait, did you want me to read that?
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
sorry. I'd like to try somewhere where there's none of them. But the war on now, and when that's over, things may be easier. It's going well, they say. They would, 393 by the way.
Yeah.
I just found it.
Okay. They would, grunted Vorbag. We'll see, but anyway, if it does not go well, there should be a lot more room. What'd you say? If we get a chance, you and me'll slip off and set up somewhere on our own with a few trusty lads somewhere where there's good, nice, and handy, and no big bosses. Ah, said Shagrat. Like old times. Yes, said Vorbag. But don't count on it. I'm not easy in my mind. As I said, the big boss is A. His voice sank almost to a whisper. A. Even the biggest can make mistakes. Something nearly slipped, you say. I say. Something has slipped, and we've got to look out. Anyway, always the poor urooks to put slips right, and small thanks. But don't forget, the enemies don't love us any more than they love him. And if they get topsides of him, or topsides on him, we're done too. But see here, when were you ordered out?
Okay, thank you. So what do we know? What do we gather here about the top ones from this conversation?
They're uneasy,
But
and
not
if they get the
perfect.
opportunity,
Uh-huh.
they're gonna desert them.
Yeah, the orcs do not see. At least some of the orcs don't seem to be serving entirely willingly, right?
Yeah.
This doesn't mean that they're good, right, or that they make good and moral choices. More on that in a second. But it does suggest that their service is, at the very least, kind of conditional, right? Like based perhaps, mostly on fear of what will happen if the top ones lose, right? Vorbag says, right, the enemies don't love us any more than they love him, right? So if the war goes badly, we're screwed too. But the other thing about the top ones here is this kind of matter of perception of the war, right? What are the top ones saying about the war? About the progress of the war.
It's not cold, something slipped out.
Well, are the top ones saying that?
No.
They're saying that it's going well,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
Right.
it's fine.
Shagrat says it's going well, they say. And Vorbag grunts, they would, right? So it seems like the orcs think they're expected to swallow propaganda from the top, right? That of course the top ones aren't going to admit when they've made a mistake. Now this mirrors pretty well the way World War I soldiers are often represented in literature, right? As being both, at least quietly critical of and also the victims of bad policy that's made by generals who are way behind the ranks, right? So Shagrat and Vorbag seem to have a kind of legitimate beef with their commanders, right? And where does their loyalty seem primarily to lie? Like, well, how would they prefer to operate, rather than with, you know, with big army units marching on Gondor and things like that?
On their own.
Yeah, on their own with a few
Trusty.
friends. What's that?
With a few trusty lads.
Yeah, with a few trusty lads. Yeah, so that they prefer to be operating on their own in small groups. Right, ambushing and waylaying undefended travelers and things like that, right? So yeah, their loyalty doesn't seem to extend much, at least doesn't seem to extend much beyond a small sphere, right? And even that seems to be kind of conditional. When they're afraid of something bigger than themselves, that overrides this loyalty to trusty lads and whatnot, right? Like, for example, when they talk about old Uthak, right? You know, Garn, said Shagrat, she's got more than one poison. When she's hunting, she just gives them a dab in the neck and they go as limp as boned fish. And then she has her way with them, right? He even describes Shelob's, the way Shelob feeds in sexual terms, right? She has her way with them. Do you remember old Uthak? We lost him for days. Then we found him in a corner. Hanging up he was, but he was wide awake and glaring. How we laughed. She'd forgotten him, maybe, but we didn't touch him. No good interfering with her. So they find their friend hanging up in Shelob's webs, glaring, right? And for all they know, they just leave him there to starve to death. Right? So, you know, because it's no good interfering with her, right? They're too afraid of Shelob to mess with her fun, right? Or to mess with her food. It's like, well, okay, we found him. Better to leave him here. And then at the same time, they're critical of Sam, who they think is a big elf warrior, for doing essentially the same thing, right? If we look on, you know, maybe the previous page or the page before, it's like, by all the signs, Captain Shagrat, I'd say there's a large warrior loose, elf most likely, with an elf sword anyway, and an axe as well maybe. And he's loose in your bounds too, and you've never spotted him. Very funny indeed, Vorbag spat. Sam smiled grimly at this description of himself. Ah, well, you always did take a gloomy view, said Shagrat. You can read the signs how you like, but there may be other ways to explain them. Anyhow, I've got watchers at every point, and I'm going to deal with one thing at a time. When I've had a look at the fellow we have caught, then I'll begin to worry about something else. It's my guess you won't find much in that little fellow, said Vorbag. He may have had nothing to do with the real mischief. The big fellow with the sharp sword doesn't seem to have thought him worth much anyhow. Just left him lying. Regular elvish trick, right? So they attribute this kind of behavior to their enemies, right? That their enemies will just leave their friends lying in the open, right? You know, exposed to danger, whatever, right? But they do the same shit, right? So they seem to assume, let me put it another way. They seem to know what loyalty means and to know right from wrong, but something drives them to choose wrong instead, right? Okay,
Well, I mean,
go ahead.
their pal was caught up in one of Shelob's webs, and instead of, you know, what we might have thought was the right thing to do is cut your buddy down. They're like, no, we're not
Yeah.
messing with her.
But
So to them, the right thing for them to do was just to cut ties and say, we're sorry, dude.
but they also think it's funny, right?
Yeah.
They're laughing about this. And I think we can connect that to that orcish sense of humor we saw in the Uruk-hai chapter, where they're making jokes about, tickling Merry and Pippin with their daggers and things like that, right? So they do seem to have a kind of cruel and nasty sense of humor, right? And so like, well, if that gets caught, it's like, oh, well, that's life, right?
And,
Sucks to be you,
making
pal.
fun of them too, because it's like,
Mm-hmm.
you're stupid at work for getting caught,
Yeah.
you know?
Mm-hmm. But they seem to regard this notion of abandoning your friend as something elves do, right? This is something the enemy does. No human feeling. But there's poor old Upback glaring at them. So I think that I think to a degree you are right. Their choices are largely constrained by what they're afraid of, right? And really the same thing has happened to Samwise here, right? Samwise's choices are also constrained by what he's afraid of. If he stays by Frodo's body, the best thing he can hope for is that he dies defending Frodo, who, as far as he knows, at least until he hears this conversation, is already dead. Which means the quest fails and Sauron wins. So everything hinges on his choice here, right? What does he fear more, feeling disloyal to his master, or feeling like he's let, the council and his companions and the whole world down, right? And there's a point at which he still thinks Frodo is dead before he hears this whole conversation. It's the section that starts with a dreadful stroke. Sam was wakened from his cowering mood.
Oh, I found it.
Okay.
389. With a dreadful stroke, Sam was wakened from his cowering mood. They had seen his master. What would they do? He had heard tales of the orcs to make the blood run cold. It could not be borne. He sprang up. He flung the quest and all his decisions away, and fear and doubt with them. He knew now where his place was and had been, at his master's side. Though what he could do there was not clear. Back he ran down the steps, down the path towards Frodo. How many are there, he thought, 30 or 40 from the tower at least, and a lot more than that from down below, I guess. How many can I kill before they get me? They'll see the flame of the sword as soon as I draw it, and they'll get me sooner or later. I wonder if any song will ever mention it, how Samwise fell in the high pass and made a wall of bodies round his master. No song. Of course not, for the ring will be found and there'll be no more songs. I can't help it. My place is by Mr. Frodo. They must understand that. Elrond and the council and the great lords and ladies with all their wisdom, their plans have gone wrong. I can't be their ring bearer, not without Mr. Frodo.
So the big thing that I want to point to in this paragraph, right? What is going to cease? What will there no longer be any of
Songs.
if Sauron wins? Yeah. And I think Sam has been preoccupied throughout with this notion of being in a tale, right? So if he dies here, if the quest fails, there will be no more songs. And I want to compare this, or I want to connect this to his musings when they remember the vial on the stairs of Cirith Ungol.
That's good. Glad you pronounced that.
Yeah, I remember there was the cartoon version that used to be on TV sometimes when I was a kid, and they always pronounce it Cirith Ungol, but apparently it's correct. The correct pronunciation is Cirith. I don't know why I know that's the correct pronunciation, but supposedly it is. All right, so it's the section that starts where Frodo says, "I don't like anything here at all." So let me know when you found it.
362.
Great. I don't like anything here at all, said Frodo. Step or stone, breath or bone, earth, air, and water all seem accursed, but so our path is laid. Yes, that's so, said Sam, and we shouldn't be here at all if we'd known more about it before we started. But I suppose it's often that way. The brave things in the old tales and songs, Mr. Frodo, adventures as I used to call them. I used to think that they were things the wonderful folk out of the stories went out and looked for. Because they wanted them, because they were exciting and life was a bit dull, a kind of a sport, as you might say. But that's not the way of it with the tales that really mattered, or the ones that stay in the mind. Folks seem to have just been landed in them, usually. Their paths were laid that way, as you put it. But I expect they had lots of chances, like us, of turning back, only they didn't. And if they had, we shouldn't know, because they'd have been forgotten. We hear about those as just went on, and not all to a good end, mind you, at least not to what folk inside a story and not outside it, call a good end. You know, coming home and finding things all right, though not quite the same, like old Mr. Bilbo. But those aren't always the best tales to hear, though they may be the best tales to get landed in. I wonder what sort of a tale we've fallen into. So this is one of those unusually perceptive and intelligent things that Sam says, right? We know that Sam loves tales, he loves poems, he loves stories, right? But what's the realization he's coming to here about the great tales?
I'm in one of them.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm in one. And
It's not a fairy story.
no. Well, and that no one goes looking to be
In that kind of story.
in the great tales, right? It's something that just you just find yourself in a situation where you do what you have to, right? And you only hear the tales of the people who accept the challenge. You don't hear the tales of those who turn back. And I think that's part of what he's thinking about when he's thinking about, you know, what happens if I stay and defend Frodo rather than going on with the ring, right? Well, I still do something heroic. I kill a bunch of orcs, you know, and preserve my master's body for a time, right? But because I turned back, there'll be no song, right? Now to continue, can I get somebody to continue reading here from I Wonder, said Frodo.
I wonder, said Frodo, but I don't know, and that's the way of a real tale. Take any one that you're fond of. You may know or guess what kind of a tale it is, happy ending or sad ending, but the people in it don't know, and you don't want them to. No, sir, of course not. Baron now, he never thought he was going to get the Silmaril from the Iron Crown and
Thangorodrim.
And yet he did, and that was a worse place and a blacker danger than ours. But that's a long tale, of course, and goes on past the happiness and into grief and beyond it. And the Silmaril went on and came to Arendelle.
Mm-hmm.
And why, sir, I never thought of that before. You've got some of the light of it in that star glass that the lady gave you. Why, to think of it, we're in the same tale still. It's going on. Don't the great tales never end?
Yeah, so this is actually pretty smart, right? Like this is a pretty insightful realization about their situation, right? And I have always thought that one of the central aspects of The Lord of the Rings that kind of makes it interesting is how much of it is a kind of meta-narrative, right? That is...
A narrative about narrative.
Yeah, exactly.
I was just about to say that it was kind of a meta moment right there.
Yeah, and when we think about like the way prolepsis and analepsis shape so many chapters of the book, right? How, you know, the story keeps getting filled in later, right, after these clues have been dropped. And then with these musings on the making of stories themselves, right? By the characters within the story. Like, if we look at the Fellowship, right, a lot of what's going on there is like just world building, right? You know, when Aragorn is telling them the great tales about Beren and Luthien and things like that, a lot of that is kind of establishing background. and just giving us these little glimpses of this older world that Tolkien has completely fleshed out, but because nobody will fucking publish it, he's putting it into this other, different narrative in a later phase of the same world, right? Giving Sam the scope here to comment on what it's like to be in a tale, right? Also demonstrates the developing intellectual maturity of this particular character, right? He's not just spouting comic poems anymore, right? This is a guy who, these conditions, that he's forced to live under are really making him grow up and see things differently. And indeed, what he's recognizing here is that this one tale, and this might be, Tolkien's clever little nod to the fact that he's mining his own older work for material constantly, is that the same tale never ends. Or at least it won't as long as Sauron doesn't win, right? And it's left to Frodo to say, right, they never end as tales, but the people in them come and go when their part's ended. Our part will end later or sooner. So it's left to Frodo to think about the darker implications of this, right? That even in this great tale, right, the tale itself doesn't end, but characters come and go. As Boromir has already come and gone, right? As various other minor characters have already come and gone. And as Frodo seems to expect he himself is going to go. But it's funny to me, and particularly interesting to me, that one of the things that Sam wants most to preserve and protect are tales. He doesn't want to be in a world where there are no more stories, right? Anyway, I know we're at only about an hour here, but this is really kind of like what I wanted to go over today, what I wanted to cover. Do you guys have any questions about anything or anything else you want to talk about?
I mean, I figure we could. We're gonna run out of class time, but just the changes in Gollum over these few chapters.
Okay, sure, yeah. What were you thinking?
Well, at the beginning of this reading, Frodo, quote unquote, betrays Gollum.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, going back to some of these ethical dilemmas we laid out, right? And does Gollum seem to have the understanding necessary to recognize what Frodo is doing?
He's like a child.
In some ways, yeah.
The whole conversation where he's trying to get him to come away from the pool, and
Yeah.
even when they're in front of Faramir, he's like, "Hey, I gotta do this
Uh-huh.
so that we can move along." It's like a bargaining with a toddler.
Yeah. And I think we can also bring Gollum into the whole Catabasis episode as well, right? Because this is where he disappears. And then, tries to attack Samwise. But if Shelob is a kind of anima figure that has to be faced in the tunnel, then Gollum is kind of like a dark double of, in some ways he's a dark double of Frodo, in that they have both experienced the power of the ring, but I think he's also a kind of dark double of Sam. And here's why. One, which of the hobbits does he actually attack in the tunnel?
Sam.
Yeah, Sam's the one he tries to kill. right? He is gonna put this little fucker's lights out, right, for being so cross and rude to him, right?
Doesn't say he like Frodo was closer to the end of the tunnel and
Yeah.
Sam was here.
Uh-huh.
And Shalab ran through, and just as Sam was going to Gollum,
Yeah.
pulls it back.
Yeah, Gollum has been lying in wait at the end of the tunnel just before Sam emerges to put his hand over his mouth and try to choke him to death, right? So it's also interesting that when Sam is having the debate with himself, right, it mirrors Gollum's way of talking to himself when no one else is there. So there's a stronger resemblance between these two characters, I think, particularly that they both are in a kind of subservient role, than there is between Gollum and Frodo. In fact, even like the part that we're talking about, that we're just talking about here, it ends with Sam saying, maybe said Sam, but I wouldn't be the one to say that. Things done and over and made into part of the great tales are different. Why, even Gollum might be good in a tale, better than he is to have by you anyway, and he used to like tales himself once, by his own account. I wonder if he thinks he's the hero or the villain. So he's acknowledging a similarity here between himself and Gollum, right? That like him, Gollum loves stories. One other thing I want to note about Gollum, then I want to hear some more about what you guys think here. Have you noticed a difference in Gollum's eyes depending on which personality is dominant?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's a different light depending on which personality is ascendant, right?
There's a green light and a pale light.
Yeah. And the pale light seems to be dominant when let's not say good, let's say benign personality is dominant. And his eyes flicker with a green light when the dark personality is dominant.
I know you hate films, but you got to give Peter Jackson credit for that in the movie.
I have never said that I hate the films.
Right? You're not fond of them.
No, there are moments that I think there are moments in the films that grate on me a little bit.
Mentioning that just made me remember that first scene where you have Gollum and Smeagol talking, and I just remember their eyes.
Uh-huh.
Oh. I'll have to go back and rewatch these movies, and look for these little tidbits.
But the eyes are his tell, right? The giveaway. And I think that green is a color that tends to be associated with greed and envy, right? With jealousy. And it's when his eyes turn green that he's giving away what it is he really wants, right? But I think, again, like sort of going back to this ethical dilemma here, what's the thing that he really wants when he comes to the pool?
Fish.
Yeah, he's hungry, right? He just wants fish. Right?
I mean, even like, Freeman's like, how did he find us? He's going to betray us all. And Frodo's like, he just wants fish. I don't even think he knows there's men here.
Yeah. Well, and that's Frodo's argument here, right? Is that it's wrong to slay a defenseless creature that's unaware of its danger, no matter what it's done, right? And there's this difference here between what is lawful and what is moral or ethical, right?
I mean, even Faramir says he's charged with protecting these lands, but he's not to shoot any beast or bird, that's not causing problems.
Yeah, although beast or bird probably doesn't include weird ghoul hobbits, right?
Yeah.
In fact, like it takes him, he says he does not like to slay anyone needlessly, but Frodo and Sam's fate is a little iffy for a while too, right? Before they can provide a proper account of themselves. This is a kind of question of justice that that the novel deals with, right? It's like, is it actually just whatever else Gollum has done in his past, right? Is it just to slay him for this specific offense, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Frodo's argument is on the side of kindness, right? That not only would it not be fair, it wouldn't be right to do this. And, he's also feeling his own obligation towards, like, Gollum wouldn't be here if not for him.
Yeah.
But I think the fish thing and the ring thing, right? These two overmastering passions of Gollum's demonstrate that his obligations or his loyalties are really only to his base desires, right? His whole identity is expressed in terms of his hunger for these two things, right? He wants to eat as much raw fish as he can. Right? Remember, even when he's talking about what he'd do if he had the ring, what was his dream?
Eat fish 3 times a day.
Yep, just to eat as much fish as he wanted, right? So the sense of obligation here is one-sided. Frodo feels obliged to protect Gollum, but Gollum does not feel a similar obligation to protect Frodo, at least until he can grab what he wants, right? And I think that also makes Gollum a kind of dark double of Sam, because Sam is so fixated on protecting Frodo, right? In fact, perhaps Sam's great ethical weakness here is that he is more loyal to Frodo than he is to the mission, right? I'm not really sure where exactly to go with this, because the whole Sam and Gollum as doubles of each other thing is something that really kind of only just occurred to me. In fact, I didn't really even think until you said, let's talk about Gollum. So I haven't quite thought this through yet, but this might actually be a kind of good and fruitful area to think through, right?
Well, Sam and Gollum both want to fulfill their promises to Frodo.
Like
Yeah.
a paper.
Sam to Gandalf by proxy. Frodo.
Yeah. Right, yeah. Sam promised to Gandalf that he'd protect Frodo, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, as far as Sam knows, Gandalf is dead. But a promise is a promise, right? And whereas Gollum, really kind of seeks to twist the promise to his own advantage, right? Right. He makes the promise, but he's always looking for ways that he can still keep the promise and get what he wants. So the promise is made for selfish rather than selfless reasons. But when we get into the Return of the King and the second half of that book, I think we're going to see other interesting similarities between Sam and Gollum when Gollum pops up again near the end. But we'll save that for then. We are actually about out of time now. So, yes, next week we start The Return of the King.
Woo!
Right, final book of the trilogy.
And wrap all this up.
Yeah, and then, yeah, we've really only got 2 more weeks of actual class time. So, all right.
Well, not wrapping the class, but wrapping up this story.
Yes.
That's what I meant.
Well, no, and hey, like I totally get it that people get excited when the end of the semester comes, right? I do too. Not that I don't like you guys. Not that I don't want to spend more time with you, but
And we're coming back.
yeah.
We'll be back.
Yeah,
You'll see us
exactly.
again August 18th.